The violent crack of a gunshot split the morning air as Vivian Sullivan clutched her baby's quilt tighter to her chest, ducking instinctively behind the overturned wagon. The once peaceful journey to California had ended in tragedy on this dusty trail just outside Hangtown in the summer of 1853. Her husband's lifeless body lay 50 yards away, where the bandits had left him after their ambush. Now she was alone, her 3-month-old daughter Elizabeth gone taken by fever just 2 days prior. Vivian's fingers traced the delicate stitching of the quilt she'd spent months making during her pregnancy. Each patch told a story: scraps from her wedding dress, a piece from her mother's apron, fabric from her father's favorite shirt. Now it was all she had left of the family she'd dreamed of building in the promised land of California. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her press herself tighter against the wagon wheel. She had nothing left to steal, but that didn't mean she wasn't in danger. The horses slowed, and she heard the creak of saddle leather as a rider dismounted. "Hello," a deep voice called out. "Anyone alive out here?" Vivian remained silent, weighing her options. She had a small Derringer in her pocket. Her husband Thomas had insisted she carry it, but only one shot. "I'm not looking for trouble," the voice continued. "Saw the wagon from the ridge. If you need help, I'm offering it." Slowly, Vivian peered around the wagon wheel. A tall man stood about 20 paces away, his hands visible at his sides. The sun silhouetted him against the morning sky, his cowboy hat casting a shadow across his features. "Stay back," Vivian warned, her voice hoarse from crying and thirst. The man nodded and took a single step backward. "Name's Kyle Eastwood. I run the Double E Ranch about 5 miles north of here." "I'm not with the men who did this." "How do I know that?" Vivian challenged, clutching the quilt tighter as fresh tears threatened. "You don't," Kyle answered honestly. "But I've got water, food, and my ranch has walls and a roof. Those are things you might need right now, madam." Vivian finally stood, keeping the wagon between them. Her dress was torn and dusty, her copper hair falling loose from its pins. She was 22, but grief had aged her overnight. "My husband is dead," she said flatly. "The bandits took everything of value. I have nothing to offer in exchange for help." Kyle's expression softened as he noticed the quilt clutched in her white-knuckled grip. "What's your name, madam?" "Vivian Sullivan." "Well, Mrs. Sullivan, I'm not asking for payment. Just seems the Christian thing to do." A sob escaped her then, unexpected and raw, as she looked down at the quilt. The tiny yellow ducks she'd embroidered along the border seemed to mock her now. Elizabeth had never even been old enough to recognize them. Kyle took a cautious step forward. Was that your child's?" Vivian couldn't speak, could only nod as tears flowed freely down her dirt-streaked face. She sank to her knees in the dust, the quilt pressed against her face to muffle her cries. Kyle approached slowly, crouching a respectful distance away. "I'm sorry," he said simply. When she didn't respond, he added, "We should bury your husband proper and then get you somewhere safe." "What's the point?" Vivian whispered. "Everything I loved is gone." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, then gestured to the quilt. "You can keep it here if you want," he said gently. "We can find a special place at the ranch, somewhere you can visit to remember." Vivian looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind. He couldn't be much older than 30. Not a handsome man by Eastern standards, his nose had clearly been broken at least once, and a scar ran along his jawline, but there was something trustworthy about him. "I can't leave it," she admitted. "It's all I have left of her." "Then you won't," he promised. "Now, will you let me help you?" After burying Thomas on a hillside overlooking the trail, Kyle helped Vivian salvage what little remained from the wagon. She had a small trunk of clothing the bandits hadn't bothered with, a family Bible, and a few cooking utensils. Everything else, their money, tools, and supplies, was gone. The ride to the Double E Ranch was silent, except for the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional creak of saddle leather. Vivian rode behind Kyle, one hand gripping his belt, the other clutching her precious quilt. She felt hollow inside, as if the bandits had stolen not just her possessions but her very soul. The ranch appeared as they crested a hill, a substantial main house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, and several outbuildings. Fields stretched out behind, and cattle dotted the pastures in the distance. It was a real working ranch, not some fly-by-night operation. It's not fancy, Kyle said, breaking the long silence, but it's solid. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, older, with graying hair and a stooped posture. He raised a hand in greeting. "That's Hank, my foreman," Kyle explained. "Been with me since I started this place 6 years ago." Hank's eyes widened as they drew closer and he could see Vivian. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, "didn't expect you back with company. Mrs. Sullivan needs our help, Hank. Her wagon was attacked on the South Trail. Husband killed, everything stolen." Hank removed his hat. "My condolences, madam." Vivian nodded weakly, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. As Kyle helped her down from the horse, her knees buckled. He caught her easily, lifting her into his arms. "Hank, have Sarah prepare the spare room," Kyle instructed, carrying Vivian toward the house. "And we'll need hot water for bathing." "Who's Sarah?" Vivian managed to ask, embarrassed by her weakness but too tired to resist. "My housekeeper. She and her husband Joe handle the cooking and most of the house chores. Good people." Inside, the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable, not lavish, but clean and well-maintained. A woman in her 50s hurried forward, her gray-streaked black hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Oh my lord," she exclaimed, taking in Vivian's appearance. "The poor dear. This way, Mr. Eastwood." Kyle carried Vivian to a small but comfortable bedroom at the back of the house. Sarah quickly turned down the covers on the bed, and Kyle gently laid Vivian down, stepping back immediately to give her space. "Sarah will help you get cleaned up," he said, moving toward the door. "Rest as long as you need. We can talk when you're feeling stronger." Vivian clutched the quilt to her chest, suddenly panicked at the thought of being separated from it. "My quilt stays with you," Kyle assured her. "Whatever you need." After he left, Sarah helped Vivian out of her filthy clothes and into a bath that somehow appeared with remarkable speed. The older woman clucked sympathetically, but asked no questions as she helped wash away the dirt and blood. Afterward, she provided a simple nightgown. "It's one of mine, so it'll be big on you," Sarah apologized, "but it's clean. We can wash your things tomorrow." "Thank you," Vivian whispered, the first words she'd spoken since arriving. Sarah patted her hand. "You get some rest now. I'll bring some broth later if you're up to it." Alone at last, Vivian curled around the quilt in the unfamiliar bed. The enormity of her losses crashed over her: Thomas, Elizabeth, her dreams of California, her entire future gone in the span of 3 terrible days. She wept until there were no tears left, then fell into an exhausted sleep. She awoke disoriented, the room dark except for a sliver of moonlight through the window. For a moment she forgot where she was, reaching automatically for Thomas beside her. The empty space brought reality crashing back. A soft knock at the door interrupted her renewed grief. "Mrs. Sullivan." Kyle's voice came through. "I don't mean to disturb you, but Sarah says you haven't eaten. May I come in?" Vivian sat up, wiping her face. "Yes," she called, her voice barely audible. The door opened and Kyle entered carrying a tray. A lantern in his other hand illuminated his concerned expression. "Sarah made chicken soup, said you'd need something easy on the stomach." He set the tray on the small table beside the bed and placed the lantern next to it. "I'll leave you to it," he said, turning to go. "Wait," Vivian said, surprising herself. "Please, I don't want to be alone with my thoughts right now." Kyle hesitated, then nodded. He pulled a chair from the corner and sat, maintaining a respectful distance. "Would it help to talk about them? Your husband and child?" Vivian picked up the bowl of soup, its warmth comforting in her hands. "Thomas was a carpenter," she began softly. "He had such skilled hands, could make the most beautiful furniture you've ever seen. We were going to California to open a shop." She took a small sip of soup. "Elizabeth was just 3 months old, born on the trail. She was so perfect, had Thomas's blue eyes and my red hair, just the tiniest wisp of it." Her voice broke. "She caught fever 5 days ago. Nothing we tried helped. She was gone so fast." Kyle remained silent, letting her speak. "Thomas wanted to turn back after we buried her, but I insisted we continue. I thought nothing could hurt worse than losing her." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I was wrong." "I'm sorry," Kyle said simply. "No one should endure what you have." Vivian placed the half-empty bowl back on the tray. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Eastwood? You don't know me." Kyle's gaze was steady. 6 years ago, I was riding through Apache territory with everything I owned. Got ambushed by raiders, not Indians, just white outlaws using the territory as cover. They took everything, shot me, and left me for dead. An old trapper found me, nursed me back to health, gave me a horse and enough supplies to make it to the nearest town. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. When I tried to thank him, know what he said? Pass it forward, son. World gives us plenty of chances to be cruel. Take the chances to be kind. Vivian looked down at the quilt still clutched in her lap. I don't know what I'm going to do now. I have no money, no family back east. For now, you'll heal, Kyle said firmly. The rest can wait. I can't impose, it's not an imposition. Ranch this size needs plenty of hands. Sarah could use help with the cooking and cleaning, or if you prefer outdoor work, Hank can always use another set of hands with the garden and chickens. He stood, but that's for later. For now, just rest. After Kyle left, Vivian finished her soup, finding comfort in its simple warmth. For the first time since the bandits attacked, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. Not hope. Exactly, it was too soon for that, but perhaps the faintest suggestion that survival might be possible. The next morning, Vivian woke to sunlight streaming through the window. Her body ached from the ordeal of the previous days, but her head felt clearer. On a chair near the bed, she found a simple dress and undergarments with a note in neat handwriting. These might fit better than mine. They belonged to my niece when she visited last summer. Sarah. After dressing, Vivian carefully folded the baby quilt and placed it on the bed. Her fingers lingered on it, reluctant to leave it behind, but she knew she couldn't carry it everywhere. The main room of the house was empty except for Sarah, who was kneading bread dough at a large table. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Sarah said warmly. "How are you feeling today?" "Better, thank you," Vivian replied. "And please call me Vivian," Sarah smiled. "Then you must call me Sarah. Are you hungry? There's eggs and bacon keeping warm." Vivian's stomach growled in response, surprising her. She hadn't felt hunger since Elizabeth died. Over a simple but hearty breakfast, Sarah explained the routines of the ranch. Kyle had 8 men working for him: the foreman Hank, his son Jacob, and 6 cowboys who handled the cattle. Sarah and her husband Joe managed the house and the kitchen garden. They all took meals together in the bunkhouse except for Kyle, who typically ate in the main house. "Mr. Eastwood's a private man," Sarah explained, "but fair, pays good wages and treats everyone with respect." "Has he ever been married?" Vivian asked, then blushed at her own forwardness. Sarah shook her head. "No, though not for lack of interested parties. The widow Carson in town has been setting her cap for him for years, and her daughter Mary isn't far behind, but he keeps to himself mostly." After breakfast, Sarah showed Vivian around the house and the immediate grounds. The ranch was larger than it had appeared the previous day, nearly 500 acres of good land with a creek running through it. The main house had 4 bedrooms, a study, a large kitchen, and a comfortable sitting room. Kyle occupied the master bedroom, Sarah and Joe had another, and the third had been given to Vivian. The fourth was used primarily for storage. "Where is Mr. Eastwood today?" Vivian asked as they walked back from the chicken coop, a basket of fresh eggs in her hands. "Rode out at dawn with the men," Sarah replied. "Spring roundup starts today. They'll be bringing in cattle from the far pastures, counting calves, branding, hard work." As they neared the house, Vivian spotted a small hill about 100 yards behind it. Something about it drew her attention. "What's that?" she asked. Sarah followed her gaze. "That's where Kyle's parents are buried. His mother died of influenza when he was just a boy. His father passed 6 years ago, just after Kyle started this ranch." Without thinking, Vivian began walking toward the hill. Sarah called after her, but something pulled Vivian forward. At the top stood 2 simple wooden crosses. The ground around them was neat and well tended, with wildflowers growing in careful patterns. "He visits them every Sunday," Sarah said quietly, having followed her up. "Brings fresh flowers in season." Vivian stared at the peaceful spot, an idea forming. "Do you think, would Mr. Eastwood mind if you what, dear? If I created a memorial for Elizabeth here? Not a grave she's buried back on the trail, but somewhere I could visit to remember her." Sarah's eyes softened. "I think he'd be honored. There's plenty of room and it's a beautiful spot. You can see for miles." That afternoon, with Sarah's help, Vivian selected a spot near the edge of the family plot. Joe helped her gather stones to form a small circle, and inside, she planted wildflower seeds Sarah provided from her garden stores. "They'll bloom through summer and fall," Sarah explained. "Different colors each month." In the center of the circle, Vivian placed a small wooden cross Joe had quickly fashioned. She'd written Elizabeth's name and dates on it with charcoal. Standing back to look at their work, Vivian felt tears gather again. But these were different, still sad, but somehow cleansing rather than devastating. "Thank you," she said to Sarah and Joe. "No need for thanks," Joe replied gruffly. "Every little one deserves to be remembered." That evening, Vivian joined Sarah and Joe for dinner in the main house. Kyle and the ranch hands were still out with the cattle and wouldn't return until late. After the meal, Sarah showed Vivian to the sitting room where a small bookshelf held an assortment of volumes. "Mr. Eastwood enjoys reading in the evenings when he has time," Sarah explained. "Said you're welcome to any book that catches your interest." Vivian ran her fingers along the spines, surprised by the variety novels by Dickens and Cooper, books of poetry, several histories, and even a few scientific texts. She selected a volume of Wordsworth's poems and settled into a comfortable chair near the fireplace. She'd read only a few pages when the door opened and Kyle entered, looking exhausted. His clothes were dusty, his face wind-burned, but he straightened when he saw her. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, removing his hat. "Good to see you up and about." Vivian closed the book. "Mr. Eastwood, I hope you don't mind. Sarah said I could borrow a book." "Not at all," he gestured to the Wordsworth. "Good choice. His nature poems suit this country." Vivian nodded, then gathered her courage. "Mr. Eastwood, I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness, and to tell you that I've made a small memorial for Elizabeth on the hill." "Sarah said you wouldn't mind, but if it's presumptuous, it's not," Kyle interrupted gently. "That hill has brought me comfort over the years. I'm glad it might do the same for you." An awkward silence fell between them. "Sarah mentioned you might be willing to help around the ranch," Kyle said finally, "but there's no hurry. Take all the time you need." "I'd like to start tomorrow, actually," Vivian replied. "Work helps. Keep the mind occupied." Kyle nodded in understanding. "Then we'll find something suitable." He moved toward the hallway that led to his room, then paused. "Good night, Mrs. Sullivan." "Vivian, please," she said. "And thank you again, Mr. Eastwood." A slight smile crossed his face. "Kyle," he corrected. "Sleep well, Vivian." Over the next few weeks, Vivian fell into the rhythm of ranch life. She helped Sarah with cooking and cleaning, collected eggs, tended the garden, and even learned to make cheese from the milk of the 2 dairy cows the ranch kept. The physical labor was exhausting, but it helped her sleep at night without dreams. Each evening after dinner, she would walk to the little memorial she'd created for Elizabeth. Sometimes she'd bring the quilt and sit there until sunset, talking softly to her daughter's memory. Other times, she'd just stand for a few moments, acknowledging her grief before returning to the house. Kyle was often away during the days, working with the cattle or handling business in town, but he always returned for dinner. Gradually, they developed a comfortable routine of sharing the evening meal, then sitting in the main room where Kyle would sometimes read aloud from whatever book Vivian had selected that day. One evening in late May, about a month after her arrival, Kyle returned from town with a newspaper and a troubled expression. "Something wrong?" Vivian asked as they sat down to dinner. Kyle hesitated. "There was a poster in town. The sheriff put it up. They caught the bandits who attacked your wagon." Vivian's hand froze halfway to her water glass. "All of them. 3 of 4. The leader's still free. They're being held in Sacramento for trial. Sheriff asked if you'd be willing to testify." The room seemed to spin around Vivian. The thought of facing the men who had destroyed her life, of reliving that terrible day in front of strangers, made her physically ill. I don't know if I can," she whispered. Kyle reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "You don't have to decide tonight. The trial's not for another month." That night, Vivian couldn't sleep. She paced her room, the baby Quilt clutched to her chest. Would justice for Thomas bring her peace? Would seeing his killers punished ease the ache of his absence? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Kyle standing there, a concerned expression on his face. "I heard you moving about," he said. "Thought you might want some company, or at least some tea." He held up a steaming mug, and despite everything, Vivian felt a small smile form. "Thank you, I'd like both." They moved to the kitchen, sitting at the table where just hours before they'd discussed the bandits. The house was quiet, Sarah and Joe having retired to their room for the night. "I keep thinking about the trial," Vivian admitted, warming her hands on the mug. "Part of me wants to see them punished, but another part is afraid," Kyle finished for her. Vivian nodded. "Not just of them, though, that too. I'm afraid of feeling it all again, the loss, the rage, the helplessness." Kyle was quiet for a long moment. "After my father died, I tracked the men who'd robbed us. Found them in a saloon in Tucson. I was going to kill them, had my gun ready." "What stopped you?" One of them was laughing with the barkeep about his newborn son, had a little sketch the local artist had done, and I realized. Killing him wouldn't bring my father back. It would just mean another child growing up without a father. "So what did you do?" "Turned them into the marshal instead. They went to prison. Not as satisfying as revenge might have felt in the moment, but I've slept better for it." He met her eyes. "Whatever you decide about the trial, I'll support you. If you want to go, I'll take you to Sacramento myself. If you don't, that's your right too." Vivian looked down at the quilt, still clutched in one arm. "Would you think less of me if I didn't go?" "Never," Kyle said firmly. "You've shown more courage this past month than most men I know show in a lifetime." His words warmed something inside her that had been cold since the attack. "Thank you for understanding." "Try to get some sleep," Kyle said, standing. "Things often look clearer in the morning." As he turned to leave, Vivian impulsively reached out and caught his hand. "Kyle, I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me that day." His fingers tightened briefly around hers. "You're stronger than you know, Vivian. You'd have found your way." But they both knew it wasn't true. Without Kyle's intervention, she might well have died on that trail, either from exposure or from her own despair. The next day, Vivian made her decision. She wouldn't attend the trial. The law would take its course without her testimony, and she would focus on rebuilding her life rather than reliving its destruction. When she told Kyle that evening, he nodded in understanding. "I'll ride to town tomorrow and have the sheriff send word to Sacramento." June arrived, bringing warmer weather and longer days. The wildflowers Vivian had planted on Elizabeth's memorial began to bloom, first purple larkspur, then orange California poppies. The sight of them brought an unexpected joy, a splash of life and color in memory of her daughter. Life at the Double E settled into a comfortable pattern. Vivian's work expanded beyond household duties as she discovered an affinity for the ranch's accounts. When Kyle mentioned struggling with the ledgers one evening, she offered to help, drawing on skills she'd learned working in her father's general store back east. "These are remarkably well organized," she told Kyle after reviewing several months of figures. "But you're not accounting for depreciation on your equipment." Kyle looked mystified. "Depreciation? The gradual decrease in value of an asset over time. Your plows and wagons wear out, so you need to save for their eventual replacement." For the next hour, Vivian explained basic accounting principles, surprised by Kyle's quick understanding and thoughtful questions. By the end of the evening, they developed a new system for tracking the ranch's finances. "You're a wonder, Vivian Sullivan," Kyle said as they closed the ledger. "If you ever decide to leave the Double E, don't tell me. Just go, because I'll be tempted to chain you to that account book." The joke surprised a genuine laugh from Vivian, her first since the tragedy. The sound startled them both, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. "It's good to hear you laugh," Kyle said softly. Vivian touched her lips, as if the laugh had left a physical trace. "I didn't think I ever would again." The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the air. Then Kyle cleared his throat and stood, gathering the ledgers. "It's getting late," he said. "Thank you for your help." That night, lying in bed with Elizabeth's quilt beside her, Vivian found herself thinking not of her losses but of Kyle's smile when she'd laughed. The realization brought a confusing mix of emotions: guilt at finding any happiness after Thomas and Elizabeth, but also a warm spark of something she wasn't ready to name. July brought scorching heat that wilted the garden and made the afternoons nearly unbearable. The ranch hands worked from dawn until mid-morning, rested during the hottest hours, then resumed their labor in the evening. Vivian adjusted her routine accordingly, rising before dawn to help Sarah with breakfast, then tackling indoor tasks during the heat of the day. One particularly hot afternoon, Vivian was alone in the house, Sarah and Joe having gone to town for supplies. She was organizing the pantry when she heard a horse approaching at speed. Moving to the window, she saw Kyle dismounting, his movements urgent. "Vivian." He called, striding toward the house. "Where's Sarah?" "Gone to town with Joe," she replied, meeting him at the door. "What's wrong?" "Fire in the north pasture, winds pushing it toward the house." His face was grim. "I need you to pack anything valuable and be ready to evacuate if I give the word. The men are trying to dig a fire break, but it's moving fast." Vivian's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "What can I do to help?" "Get water to the men if you can. They're about a quarter-mile north. But be ready to leave at a moment's notice." Without waiting for a response, Kyle remounted and galloped back toward the smoke now visible on the horizon. Vivian worked quickly, filling every available container with water from the well. She hitched the wagon with shaking hands. Kyle had taught her the basics over the past months and loaded it with water barrels, food, and blankets. She ran to her room and grabbed Elizabeth's quilt, along with the few possessions she'd managed to save from the wagon attack. As she worked, she tried to ignore the growing roar of the fire and the darkening sky. The smell of smoke became stronger, and ash began to fall like evil snow around the ranch buildings. When the wagon was loaded, Vivian drove north toward the line of men visible in the distance. The sight that met her was terrifying, a wall of flame at least 20 feet high advancing across the dry grass, and before it, Kyle and his men desperately digging a trench to stop its progress. Their faces were black with soot, their clothes singed. "Water." She called, pulling the wagon as close as she dared. The men rushed over, drinking deeply and pouring water over their heads and necks. Kyle reached her last. "You should head back to the house," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Be ready to leave." "I can help," Vivian insisted. "Tell me what to do." Kyle looked like he wanted to argue, but the fire's roar was growing louder. "We need to widen the break. Can you use a shovel?" "Yes." He handed her one from the wagon, then turned to the men. "Another 50 feet. If we can hold it here, the house should be safe." For the next hour, Vivian dug alongside the ranch hands, her arms aching, lungs burning from the smoke. The fire advanced relentlessly, consuming everything in its path. Twice they had to retreat as the flames jumped their incomplete line. "It's no use," Hank shouted finally. "We need to fall back to the creek." Kyle's face was grim as he surveyed their failing efforts. "Get the men to the creek," he ordered Hank. "I'll meet you there." As the others retreated, Kyle turned to Vivian. "We need to get to the house. Grab what you can and meet me at the creek." "What about you?" she demanded, seeing the determination in his eyes. "I'm going to try one more fire break closer to the house. If I can burn a counterfire, that's too dangerous. I'm not losing this ranch," Kyle said fiercely. "Not after everything it's taken to build it." Vivian grabbed his arm. "And I'm not losing you, not after everything." She stopped, surprised by her own vehemence. For a heartbeat they stared at each other, the world narrowed to just the two of them despite the inferno approaching. Then Kyle nodded. "Together then." "But if I tell you to run, you run." "Understood." They raced back to the house, where Kyle gathered lanterns and kerosene. His plan was desperate but might work. Burn a controlled line between the approaching fire and the house, removing the fuel the wildfire needed to advance. Working frantically, they created a new fire line 200 yards from the house, using wet blankets to control its spread toward the buildings while letting it burn away from them, toward the approaching wildfire. "If this works," Kyle explained, "the two fires will meet and die out for lack of fuel." As the counterfire grew, they retreated to the house, watching anxiously. The gamble paid off when the main fire reached their burned area. It slowed, then weakened, unable to jump the barren ground they'd created. By nightfall, the immediate danger had passed. The north pasture was destroyed, along with a section of fence and one outbuilding, but the house and main barn were safe. Kyle's men returned from the creek, exhausted but relieved. In the aftermath, as the ranch hands assessed damage and tended minor burns, Vivian found Kyle sitting alone on the porch steps, staring at the still smoldering landscape. She sat beside him, offering a cup of coffee. "You saved it," she said simply. Kyle took the cup but didn't drink. "We saved it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done that counterfire alone." They sat in companionable silence, the events of the day settling around them like the ash that dusted everything in sight. "I meant what I said out there," Vivian said finally, her voice barely audible. "About not losing you." Kyle turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Vivian, I know it's too soon," she interrupted. "I know I should still be grieving Thomas, and I am, but today when I thought you might." She swallowed hard. "It made me realize that somehow, without noticing, you've become important to me." Kyle set down his coffee and tentatively reached for her hand. "You've become important to me too," he admitted. "More than I had any right to let happen. You're still healing, and I don't want to complicate that." Vivian turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. "Life is complicated," she said softly. "Today proved that. It also proved how quickly it can all vanish." Kyle's thumb traced gentle circles on her skin. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to pretend I don't feel something for you. I'm not ready to act on it, not yet. But I don't want to deny it exists either." Kyle lifted her hand and pressed it gently to his lips. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. No expectations, no pressure." The simple gesture, his lips against her skin, sent warmth through Vivian that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the fire. "One day at a time," she agreed. August brought cooler temperatures and the first hints that summer would eventually yield to fall. The ranch, recovered from the fire, new grass was already sprouting in the burned pasture, and the men had rebuilt the destroyed section of fence. Vivian's role at the ranch continued to expand. Beyond helping with the accounts, she'd started teaching Jacob, Hank's 18-year-old son, to read and write properly in the evenings. The boy was quick to learn and eager for knowledge beyond ranching. "You've got a real gift for teaching," Kyle remarked one evening after observing a lesson. Jacob's father says he's never seen the boy so interested in anything that wasn't a horse or a gun. Vivian smiled, pleased by the compliment. "He reminds me of my younger brother. Same eagerness to learn, same impatience with the process." It was the first time she'd mentioned her family back east, and Kyle noted it. "You never talk about them." Vivian's smile faded. "We had a falling out when I married Thomas. My father didn't approve, thought Thomas's dreams of California were foolish. Said if I went with him, I shouldn't bother coming back. And your mother died when I was 16. Just my father and brother now, though I doubt they'd claim me." Kyle frowned. "Family should stand together no matter what." "Not all families are like that," Vivian said quietly. Later that night, unable to sleep, Vivian took Elizabeth's quilt and walked to the memorial on the hill. The moon was full, illuminating the wildflowers now in full bloom. She spread the quilt on the ground and sat, looking out over the ranch below. From this vantage point, she could see the entire property, the house with its warm yellow windows, the barn, the corrals, and beyond them, the pastures stretching to the horizon. In the 3 months she'd been here, it had begun to feel like home in a way she hadn't expected. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Kyle approaching. He stopped a respectful distance away. "May I join you?" he asked. Vivian nodded, patting the quilt beside her. Kyle sat, his shoulder not quite touching hers. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Had some things on my mind." He hesitated. "I've been thinking about what you said about your family," Vivian sighed. "It's ancient history now. Maybe not. I was wondering if you'd consider writing to them, letting them know you're alive at least. Why would you care about my relationship with my father?" Kyle was quiet for a moment. "Because life's too short for unresolved regrets. My father and I argued the day before he died. Nothing important, just stubbornness on both sides. Never got to make it right." Vivian understood then. "And you think I should make it right with mine while I can?" "I think you should decide if it's worth trying. Some relationships can't be fixed, but some can if given the chance." Vivian leaned slightly, letting her shoulder rest against his. "I'll think about it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. After a while, Vivian spoke again. "Elizabeth would have been 8 months old today." Kyle's arm slipped around her shoulders, a gentle comfort. "Tell me about her." "She had the tiniest fingernails," Vivian said, the memory both painful and precious. "And this little wrinkle in her forehead when she was thinking hard about something. Thomas said she got that from me." Kyle's thumb traced small circles on her upper arm as she talked, sharing memories of her daughter's brief life. When she finally fell silent, he pulled her closer, and she rested her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for listening," she whispered. "Always," he promised. The next morning, Vivian wrote a letter to her father and brother, her first communication since leaving Philadelphia more than a year earlier. She kept it simple, explained what had happened to Thomas and Elizabeth, that she was safe at her ranch near Hangtown, and that she was slowly rebuilding her life. "I don't know if you'll want to hear from me," she wrote in conclusion, "but I needed you to know I'm alive. I think of you often, despite our differences." She gave the letter to Kyle when he rode to town that afternoon, watching him go with mixed emotions. She didn't expect a response, but writing the letter had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she carried. September brought the harvest and cattle sales. Kyle was frequently away, taking herds to market in Sacramento or negotiating with buyers. The ranch was busiest in this season, and Vivian found herself taking on more responsibilities in Kyle's absence. One evening, as she updated the ledgers in Kyle's study, Vivian came across a letter from a bank in San Francisco. It detailed terms for a loan Kyle had taken to expand the ranch, a substantial sum that would come due in December. The letter hinted that an extension might be difficult to obtain if full payment wasn't made. When Kyle returned 2 days later, Vivian approached him privately after dinner. "I saw the bank letter," she admitted. "I wasn't snooping, it was with the accounts." Kyle's expression tightened. "You weren't meant to see that. Are you in financial trouble?" he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not exactly. The ranch is profitable, but the drought this summer hurt our yields, and the fire took out some of our best grazing land. I'm short on what I need for the loan payment, but I'll figure it out." "How short?" Vivian pressed. Kyle named a figure that made her eyes widen. "That's more than I thought." "I've got some options," Kyle said, clearly wanting to end the conversation. "Don't worry about it." But Vivian did worry. Over the next week, she noticed Kyle meeting with various men from town, the banker, a land speculator, even the owner of the sawmill. Each time, he returned looking more frustrated. Finally, after a particularly tense dinner where Kyle barely spoke, Vivian confronted him in his study. "You're going to sell part of the ranch, aren't you?" she asked without preamble. Kyle looked up from the papers spread across his desk, surprise and then resignation crossing his face. "How did you know?" "The men you've been meeting with, and you've been measuring the north section." Kyle nodded slowly. "The north section would fetch enough to cover the loan. It's good timber land." "But it's part of your parents' dream for this place," Vivian said, remembering stories he'd told about his father's plans for the ranch. "Dreams have to yield to reality sometimes." Vivian bit her lip, considering her next words carefully. What if there was another way? Kyle looked skeptical. "I've explored every option, Vivian." "Not every option," she said quietly. "I received a letter today from my father." Kyle straightened. "He wrote back," Vivian nodded. "More than that, he's coming to California. He'll be in Sacramento next week." "That's wonderful news, but I don't see how it helps with the loan." Vivian took a deep breath. "My father is Daniel Sullivan." Kyle's eyes widened in recognition. "The Philadelphia shipping merchant. Yes, he wants to see me to reconcile," and she hesitated. "He mentioned he's looking for investment opportunities in California." Understanding dawned on Kyle's face. "You want to ask your father to invest in the Double E. It would solve your financial problems. And it would be a good investment for him. The ranch is sound, just temporarily short on cash." Kyle stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering. After the way he treated you when you married Thomas." Vivian moved to stand beside him at the window. "People change. Losing a child changes you. Maybe losing a daughter even temporarily changed him too." Kyle turned to face her. "And what would your father expect in return for this investment? Would you have to return east with him?" The question revealed a fear Vivian hadn't realized Kyle harbored. "No," she said firmly. My life is here now, with or without his investment. Something in Kyle's expression softened. With me, Vivian met his gaze steadily. If you want me to stay. Kyle's hand came up to touch her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. I want you to stay more than I've wanted anything in a very long time. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Kyle leaned down, his intention clear. Vivian closed her eyes as his lips met hers, gentle and questioning. She answered by stepping closer, her hands finding his shoulders. The kiss deepened, months of growing feelings finally acknowledged. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unevenly. I've wanted to do that since July, Kyle admitted, his forehead resting against hers. Vivian smiled. I've wanted you to since July. He kissed her again, briefly this time. About your father's offer, we'll discuss it with him together, Vivian decided, as partners. The word hung in the air between them, its meaning expanding beyond business. Partners, Kyle agreed, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. I like the sound of that. The following week, Vivian and Kyle traveled to Sacramento to meet Daniel Sullivan. Vivian was a bundle of nerves as they entered the hotel where her father was staying. It had been nearly 2 years since she'd last seen him, their parting marked by angry words and hurt feelings. The man who rose to greet them looked older than Vivian remembered. His once dark hair was now steel gray and new lines creased his face, but his eyes, so like her own, were warm as they found her. Vivian, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My dear girl. Vivian stepped forward hesitantly, unsure of her welcome despite the letter. Her father opened his arms and she went into them, tears springing to her eyes as he embraced her tightly. I thought I'd lost you too, he whispered against her hair. After your mother, and then when we heard about the attacks on the wagon trains. I'm sorry, Father, Vivian said, pulling back to look at him. For leaving the way I did, for the things I said. Daniel shook his head. I'm the one who should apologize. I was wrong to give you that ultimatum. Your mother would have been ashamed of me. He glanced over her shoulder at Kyle, who stood respectfully near the door. And who is this gentleman? Vivian beckoned Kyle forward. Father, this is Kyle Eastwood. He saved my life after the attack. This is his ranch I've been living at. The two men sized each other up, then shook hands firmly. I owe you a debt I can never repay, Mr. Eastwood, Daniel said gravely. Thank you for protecting my daughter when I could not. She's done as much for the ranch as it's done for her, sir, Kyle replied. Vivian is exceptional. The way he said it, with such quiet certainty, made Vivian's heart beat faster. Over dinner, Vivian shared the full story of the attack, of losing Elizabeth, and of her months at the Double E. Kyle spoke of the ranch's operations and potential, careful not to overstate its prospects, but painting an honest picture of its value. So you need an investor, Daniel summarized when they'd finished. We need a partner, Kyle corrected, glancing at Vivian. Someone who believes in what we're building. Daniel's sharp eyes moved between them, noting the we and the look they shared. And what exactly are you two building together? The question addressed more than the ranch, and they all knew it. Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks but met her father's gaze directly, a future father, one I didn't think I'd have again after Thomas and Elizabeth. Daniel nodded slowly. I see, he turned to Kyle. And your intentions toward my daughter, Mr. Eastwood? Kyle didn't hesitate. I love her, sir. I'd like to marry her, with your blessing if possible, without it if necessary. The declaration stunned Vivian, though perhaps it shouldn't have. They hadn't spoken explicitly of marriage, but the direction of their relationship had been clear since that first kiss. You haven't asked me yet, she pointed out, finding her voice. Kyle's smile was tender. I was planning something a bit more romantic than a business dinner with your father. Daniel laughed unexpectedly, breaking the tension. Well, I can see you're both determined people. And I do have one condition for my investment. What's that? Kyle asked warily. That I be invited to the wedding. Daniel's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. I've already missed too many important moments in your life, Vivian. I don't want to miss any more. The meeting concluded with a handshake agreement. Daniel would invest the amount needed to pay off the loan, plus additional capital for improvements, in exchange for a 20% share in the ranch's profits. The papers would be drawn up the following day. As they walked back to their hotel's separate rooms, as propriety demanded, Kyle took Vivian's hand. "I meant what I said in there," he told her. "About loving you, about wanting to marry you." Vivian squeezed his hand. "I know, and I love you too." Kyle stopped walking, turning to face her in the quiet street. "This isn't how I planned to do this, but—" He went down on one knee, still holding her hand. "Vivian Sullivan, will you marry me? Build a life with me at the Double E?" Vivian's free hand went to her heart. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Kyle stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. When they separated, both were smiling. "I have something for you back at the ranch," he said. "Was going to use it when I proposed properly." "You can still give it to me," Vivian teased. "I might say yes again." They returned to the Double E 2 days later with the loan paid off, new investment capital secure, and wedding plans underway. Daniel would return for the ceremony in October, bringing Vivian's brother James with him. That evening, Kyle took Vivian to the hill where both his parents' and Elizabeth's memorial lay. He carried a small wooden box, which he presented to her as they stood beside the colorful wildflowers that marked her daughter's memory. "I wanted to give you this here," he said. With all our family present, Vivian opened the box to find a delicate gold ring with a small diamond. It was simple but beautiful, clearly chosen with care. "It was my mother's," Kyle explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found someone special." Tears pricked Vivian's eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered, looking from the ring to the memorials. "And you're right, this is where our family is." Kyle wrapped his arms around her from behind, and together they watched the sun set over the ranch. "Not all of our family," he murmured against her hair, "just the ones watching over us." "Do you think they approve?" Vivian asked softly. "Thomas and Elizabeth, your parents." "I think they want us to be happy," Kyle replied, "to live fully in their memory." Vivian turned in his arms to face him. "I never thought I'd find happiness again, not after everything, but you've given me a second chance at life, Kyle." "We've given each other a second chance," he corrected gently, "and I intend to make the most of it." October brought perfect weather for a wedding. The ceremony was held on the hill, with Elizabeth's memorial and the Eastwood graves as silent witnesses. Daniel walked Vivian down a path lined with autumn wildflowers, where Kyle waited beneath an arch the ranch hands had constructed of twisted branches and ribbons. Vivian wore a simple cream dress that Sarah had helped her make, with a crown of wildflowers in her copper hair. Around her shoulders, she draped Elizabeth's quilt not as part of her attire, but as a way of including her daughter in the day. The guests were few: Daniel and James Sullivan, the ranch hands and their families, and a handful of neighbors and friends from Hangtown. The local minister performed the ceremony, his words carried on the gentle breeze across the hill. When it came time for the vows, Kyle took Vivian's hands in his. "I take you as you are," he said, his voice clear and certain, "with your grief and your joy, your past and your future. I promise to walk beside you through whatever life brings, to honor your strength and to love you until my last breath." Vivian's eyes shone with unshed tears as she responded, "I take you as my partner in all things. I bring to you my broken heart, made whole again by your kindness. I promise to stand by you, to build with you, and to love you through all the seasons of our lives together." The celebration afterward was a true Western affair, a feast prepared by Sarah and the neighboring women, music from a fiddler and banjo player from town, and dancing that lasted well into the night. Vivian danced with her father, her brother, and finally, under the stars with her new husband. "Happy?" Kyle asked as he held her close during a slow waltz. Vivian looked around at the ranch that had become her home, at the people who had become her family, and up at the man who had helped her find her way back to life. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Later, as the guests began to depart, Vivian slipped away to the memorial hill. She carefully folded Elizabeth's quilt and placed it at the center of the stone circle, then covered it with a small wooden box Kyle had made specially for this purpose. It would protect the precious quilt from the elements while keeping it in the place where her daughter's memory lived. "I'll always love you, my sweet girl," she whispered, touching the box gently. "You'll always be part of me." Kyle found her there, joining her in silent communion with the past. After a moment, he placed a small bundle of fresh wildflowers beside the box. "Ready?" he asked softly, offering his hand. Vivian nodded, taking his hand and looking once more at the quilt's resting place. The past would always be with her, but now it existed alongside a future full of promise. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." 1 year later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the Double E Ranch as Vivian stood on the porch, watching Kyle ride in from the north pasture. At 10 months pregnant, she felt as big as one of the prize bulls they'd purchased with Daniel's investment, but the sight of her husband still made her heart quicken. The ranch had thrived over the past year. With the additional capital, Kyle had been able to expand their cattle operation, improve irrigation for the crops, and even build a proper schoolhouse where Vivian now taught the children of neighboring ranchers 3 days a week. Daniel had visited twice more, clearly proud of his daughter and growing increasingly fond of his son-in-law. He'd even brought James for an extended stay last winter, and the young man had shown such aptitude for ranch work that Kyle had offered him a permanent position starting next spring. Kyle dismounted at the corral, handing the reins to Jacob before making his way to the house. His face lit up at the sight of Vivian, as it did every day without fail. "How are my girls today?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her rounded belly. "Restless," Vivian replied with a smile. "I think she's eager to meet us." They decided to name their daughter Margaret Elizabeth, honoring both Kyle's mother and Vivian's firstborn. The prospect of holding another child both terrified and exhilarated Vivian. The loss of Elizabeth would always be with her, but the grief had softened with time, becoming a tender spot rather than an open wound. "Sarah says dinner will be ready soon," Vivian said as Kyle helped her back inside. "And Hank wanted you to know the new bull arrived from Sacramento. Said he's the finest animal he's ever seen." Kyle nodded, but his attention was clearly on his wife rather than ranch business. "You should be resting," he scolded gently. "Doc Mason said not to overdo it." Vivian rolled her eyes. "If I rest anymore, I'll take root in that chair. Besides, I wanted to watch for you." Kyle's expression softened. "Well, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Later that night, as they lay in bed, Vivian felt the baby shift and kick particularly hard. She gasped, grabbing Kyle's hand and placing it where their daughter was making her presence known. "She's strong," Kyle marveled, his face filled with wonder. "Like her father," Vivian murmured. Kyle shook his head. "Like her mother. You're the strongest person I know, Vivian Eastwood." The name still gave her a thrill, even after a year of marriage. "I wasn't strong when you found me," she reminded him. "I was broken. You were hurt," Kyle corrected. "There's a difference. You survived something that would have destroyed most people. And look at you now teaching, helping run the ranch, about to be a mother again." Vivian placed her hand over his where it rested on her belly. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." "Yes, you could have," Kyle insisted, "but I'm grateful every day that you didn't have to." 3 days later, Margaret Elizabeth Eastwood made her entrance into the world after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and a lusty cry that announced her arrival to the entire ranch. When the midwife placed the swaddled infant in Vivian's arms, the rush of love was both familiar and entirely new. This child was not Elizabeth, would never replace her, but would have her own place in Vivian's heart. Kyle sat on the edge of the bed, his finger caught in his daughter's tiny but surprisingly strong grip. The wonder on his face made Vivian fall in love with him all over again. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She is," Vivian agreed. Then, after a moment, "Would you bring me something from the drawer in the sitting room?" The small package wrapped in brown paper. Kyle looked curious but did as she asked. When he returned, Vivian carefully handed him the baby and unwrapped the package. Inside was a small, exquisitely made quilt, a miniature version of Elizabeth's, but with its own unique design. "I've been working on it for months," Vivian explained. "For Margaret, I wanted her to have her own, but with elements that honor her sister." The quilt featured the same yellow ducks along the border that had adorned Elizabeth's, but the center pattern was different, a rising sun over rolling hills that resembled the view from their memorial spot. Kyle's eyes glistened as he took in the beautiful handiwork. "It's wonderful, Vivian." A perfect gift for our daughter. He placed the baby back in Vivian's arms, and she wrapped the small quilt around Margaret. As if sensing the significance of the moment, the infant opened her eyes and gazed up at her parents. "Welcome to the world, Margaret Elizabeth," Vivian whispered. "You are so loved." 5 years later, the Double E Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous operations in the county. What had once been Kyle's struggling venture was now a thriving enterprise, with expanded cattle herds, productive croplands, and even a small apple orchard that Vivian had insisted on planting 3 years earlier. The schoolhouse had expanded too, with Vivian now employing another teacher to help with the 20-some children who attended from neighboring ranches. Her own children were among them 5-year-old Margaret and 3-year-old Daniel, named for his grandfather. On a warm October afternoon, the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Kyle surprised Vivian by taking her up to the Memorial Hill. The children were with Sarah for the day, giving them a rare moment alone. "I have something to show you," he said, leading her toward Elizabeth's memorial. The stone circle had been maintained over the years, fresh wildflowers planted each season. The wooden box that held Elizabeth's quilt had weathered but remained sturdy, protected by the small shelter Kyle had built over it 2 winters ago. Beside it now stood something new, a beautifully crafted wooden bench, positioned to face both the memorial and the spectacular view of the ranch below. "Kyle, it's beautiful," Vivian exclaimed, running her hand along the polished wood. "I thought you might like somewhere to sit when you come up here," he explained. "Especially since you have news to share with Elizabeth." Vivian's eyes widened. She'd only confirmed her suspicions that morning, hadn't yet found the right moment to tell Kyle. "How did you know?" His smile was tender. "You've been sick in the mornings, just like with Margaret and Daniel, and you've been craving those pickled peaches again." Vivian laughed, leaning against him. "And here I thought I was being so discreet. Nothing about you escapes my notice, Mrs. Eastwood," Kyle said, kissing her forehead. "Not after 5 years." They sat on the bench, looking out over their domain. The ranch buildings gleamed in the afternoon sun, cattle dotted the distant pastures, and the apple trees formed neat rows on the eastern slope. Beyond, Hangtown had grown as well, the gold rush giving way to more stable industries, including a lumber mill that Kyle had invested in the previous year. "Did you ever imagine this?" Vivian asked, gesturing to the prosperous scene below. "When you found me by that overturned wagon?" Kyle shook his head. "I just wanted to help a woman in distress. I never dreamed she'd change my entire life." Vivian turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. "Do you remember what you said to me that day, when I was crying over Elizabeth's quilt?" "I said you could keep it here if you wanted," Kyle recalled. "Seems like such a small thing now." "It wasn't small to me," Vivian said softly. "It was the first kindness I'd received after days of horror. It was the first moment I thought I might survive." Kyle squeezed her hands. "I'm glad you did. So am I." Vivian leaned forward to kiss him, a kiss that still held the same passion as their first. When they parted, she added, "And I'm glad our family keeps growing. I think Elizabeth would be pleased to have another sibling to watch over." "I think she would," Kyle agreed, placing a hand gently on Vivian's still flat stomach. "Boy or girl, what do you think?" "Girl," Vivian said confidently. "And I'm thinking we might call her Hope." Kyle nodded, understanding the significance. "Hope Eastwood, I like it." They remained on the bench until sunset, talking about the future, about their children, about the life they'd built from the ashes of tragedy. As the sky turned gold and then deep purple, Kyle helped Vivian to her feet. "We should get back," he said. "Sarah will have dinner waiting, and the children will be full of stories from their day." Vivian nodded, but paused for a moment at Elizabeth's memorial. She knelt, touching the box that held the quilt, the tangible reminder of her first daughter. "I'll bring your sister to meet you when she arrives," she promised softly. Then, standing, she took Kyle's hand. "Let's go home." As they walked down the hill toward the warmly lit house, Vivian reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of despair, beside that overturned wagon, to this moment of contentment, with a man who had seen her at her most broken and loved her anyway. She had not forgotten Thomas, or Elizabeth would never forget them. But alongside that grief, she had built a new life, one filled with love and purpose. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness, a cowboy who had seen a woman crying over her baby's quilt and offered her a place to keep it, a place that had become home.